Not yet on YouTube.
Hi, Chris. Why are you wearing a mask, Chris? Okay. A lot of people I know, but they don't have their cameras on. All right. Okay. And you will let people in, Shalini.
I'll do that. Yeah, don't worry.
So good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for your patience in waiting for us to start the event this evening in India, at least. My name is Sarah. I'm an adjunct professor at the Center for Water Research, the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at ISA Pune, and that's the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the second season of our monthly talks at the Center for Water Research. The center was launched in November 2020 to facilitate interdisciplinary research, both applied, fundamental, and place-based research around various aspects of water.
Sarah, you
to climate change and various things linked to water. But this season, I'm going to have to ask people to mute themselves if they're not speaking, please. This season, we're looking at various ways in which we can communicate around water, primarily because we're concerned about what water ethics and what that means for us, given so many competing challenges around water in our world now. And I think we need this kind of moral compass to guide us when we think about water from a lens that is both linked to issues around justice, but also sustainability, given competing users. And so Professor James Wescoat, who will be introduced shortly, is our first speaker to launch this season of talks on water ethics, and also around the arts, because the season is being don't know why that's happening. I'm being muted. Anyway, the season is being curated by the Living Waters Museum, which is a virtual repository which we launched in 2017, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later. But the talk this afternoon is also co-hosted with the MIT Water Center, and it is my pleasure to invite Kirsten, who is the president of the MIT Water Club, to say a few words about that, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Pushkar, who is going to moderate and introduce our speaker for the evening. So Kirsten, over to you.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. So as you said, I am the president of MIT Water Club. I'm a graduate student at MIT. I've only been a part of the Water Club for a year, but it's been around since 2012. And it's changed a lot over the years, but its primary purpose is to serve as a hub for anything water related on MIT's campus. So our core membership is around 20 or 30 people, but we have a large network of people we've connected with all over the community, all over the world, and within the university. So our main focus is to facilitate connections between people in water and connect people with opportunities. One of our main events that we host each fall is the Water Summit, where we bring together a group of diverse minds in water around a common theme. So this year our theme is going to be coastal cities and ecosystems. And so we have panels, we have networking, we have activities all around our shared connection to water. So that's sort of one of we have a couple of other events throughout the year, but they all sort of coalesce around that goal to bring together people and connect each other over water. And see kind of what comes out of that. So, we love doing stuff like this where we're able to help out to bring in, people with expertise that we can learn from. And I know we've worked with Professor Wescoat before. We're happy to, be in collaboration with him anytime. So I'm really looking forward to this talk.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Kristen, and thank you for endorsing this talk. But before I hand over to Pushkar, just a few house rules to keep yourself muted during this talk, to keep obviously cell phones switched off, to write any questions and comments you may have in the chat box, but we will also allow you, once the talk is over, to raise your hand or use the emoticon, whatever over there, to ask a question as well. So with that, it is my pleasure now to hand over to Professor Pushkar Soni, who is the chair of the Humanities and Social Sciences faculty at ISER. And Pushkar, I'd like you then to please introduce our speaker for the evening, Professor James Wescoat.
Thank you, Sarah. Professor James Wescoat needs no introduction to people who know South Asia or have been working with water. But let me just say something in 2 or 3 sentences, which of course cannot encapsulate all his achievements. He is the Aga Khan Professor Emeritus of Landscape Architecture and Geography at MIT. He has been involved with the Aga Khan program in Islamic architecture at MIT and Harvard for many years. I just muted the person. He has worked extensively on South Asia, particularly Mughal gardens, and some of that work has won a lot of awards. Again, he's worked with water policy research in various geographies around the world, United States and South Asia included. And he works on what he calls intermediate scale regional water systems. Of course, he is no stranger to the Center for Water Research at ISER Pune, being on the advisory board. And it's, of course, our great pleasure to welcome him and host him for a talk on, as it's titled, Reconstructing the Duties of Water in India on the Prospects for Value Pluralism. Thank you. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Pushkar and Sarah and Kristen, and I'll try to share screen now. And
we can see that.
okay, great. I'll go to the, how about now?
Yes, fine.
All set. Okay, terrific. Thank you again. And it's really, for me, a great opportunity to share some new ideas about water ethics and values, and also to help contribute to this question of what are the contribution of the arts to a new water ethic that the Center for Water Resources at ISER is taking up as its theme this year. And this is part of a larger study of comparative water ethics and value pluralism for me. I was not sure initially how to address the emphasis on the arts in this paper, but I settled on an approach that will combine a process of storytelling and mapping. So this is going to be the genre that I'll try to develop here. And my story is going to begin on a hot summer day in Lahore, Pakistan, about 30 years ago, in a conversation with an environmentalist friend about the distress of thirsty animals in the city. And that study led to a paper on the right of thirst for animals in Islamic water law, as compared with animals' actual access to water, both in the Punjab and also in my home state at that time of Colorado, where there's no acknowledgement, even up to this time, of either a human right to water or an animal right to water. States in the US don't recognize such rights. And so the paper underscored the fundamental right to water in Islamic water law, but it also came to a realization of the importance of social duties to ensure access to water, which had accomplished some important standards in the US context. So in the mapping process here, let's just put this study on the map and proceed. About 15 years later, I began working on a state duty, which is known as the public trust doctrine. That doctrine establishes that states have an inalienable responsibility for the lands and the waters that they hold in trust for the public, and especially deals with coastal waters. Now, the paper retraced the public trust doctrine from its origins in Roman law to various European bodies of law, and the bottom left map displays this in more detail, US and colonial laws. But the paper culminated with an extraordinary set of cases, public interest litigation cases in India, and two in Pakistan also, that greatly expand the scope of the state's public trust responsibilities and duties well beyond the precedents in other parts of the world. So we add this to our map. Then some 5 years later, I became interested in an irrigation standard, a standard of agricultural water use known as the duty of water, and wrote a paper that traced its origins back to steam engine efficiency, of all things, in the United Kingdom. James Watt's steam engine there, but then forward to canal irrigation systems in northern India, including the Upper Ganga Canal, bottom right, and also, interestingly, to the Western United States. Now, the duty of water standard establishes, is concerned with the careful management of water without waste. Interestingly, in the US context, it established a lower bound of use. You have to at least irrigate 60 to 80 acres per CFS of water delivered. In India, the irrigation standards were at the other end, the upper bound. How much land can you spread water over? And so there, the standard was regarded as a much higher, 218 to 600 acres per CFS. A type of deficit irrigation that actually helped to fuel the groundwater development patterns that occurred in subsequent decades to make up for the deficits there. Now, this standard, the duty of water standard, was superseded over time and gave way to other measures of irrigation efficiency. But it led to the question, if these were the duties related to water in the 20th century, what might be the duties that we should be considering in the 21st century? And in a couple of papers, the conclusion of a couple of papers that I was writing started to compile possible duties and associated ethics, which are listed here. And I don't want to go into them because the approach that I'm going to kind of take leaps off from this point of research to a different approach. And that approach was related to the work that we've been doing over most recently in Maharashtra in the rural drinking water sector, where we've been interviewing in villages what the current conditions of water service are. Places like in the left-hand slide here, an image of in Bor Taluka, just upstream of you all in Pune. And I include the image on the right with, not for our picture, but for the portraits of the leaders above us. So you'll see in this Zilla Parishad district office, Chhatrapati Shivaji, Dr. Ambedkar, and Gandhiji, who have profoundly different views of and values with respect to water, governance, and social duties. And I was struck by just what a range of inspirational figures were on the wall here, and started to take photographs in other district headquarters, and you can start to see that they range all across the political spectrum, and then also have religious figures and Maharashtrian saints. And I said, wow, this is really an insight into some of the values that are shaping, or that might be shaping local administrative practice in Maharashtra. Now, in all of the studies that I've been mentioning, the concept of duty was important, but it was examined somewhat informally, descriptively, and not so much on a theoretical level. And the same was true with respect to values and what I've called value pluralism, the multiplicity of values in a place and how they relate to one another. So the aim of this talk is really to clarify what one means by water duties and also value pluralism, and to show how they might be relevant for the rural drinking water sector in India. Now, the process of clarifying duties for me turned out to be a surprisingly long journey. It began with a search for ideas about duty in the international water ethics literature. And we've been proceeding from left to right here, and then shifted toward the question of duty in Western ethics. Then from that to the concepts of duty in Indian ethics, and ultimately hoping to arrive at a sense of what duty means and could mean in the field of Indian water ethics. So this is our outline, and I'll just hit a few high points for each of these steps along the way. It was surprising in the literature on international water ethics, and the compilation or a listing of them is some major works is shown here, to see how relatively, the bottom line was that there was relatively little writing in those works on water duties. And similarly, limited writing about water ethics. There are some important exceptions, like the Marcelino Botan Forum on Water Ethics had some important works on South Asia, but the writings tended to be problem-driven and very substantive, and not so much inclined towards clarifying what's meant by water duties. So that led to the question, well, what does duties mean if it's not so much clarified or elaborated in international water ethics? How about in the field of Western ethics generally, from which some of that writing is derived? And here we have three major branches of ethics in Western social thought, Western philosophy. And the one that's most relevant for us here is the deontological tradition, which is derived from the Greek word for duty, deon. And its leading proponent was Immanuel Kant, focused on moral principles, and who argued that pure moral principles and duties are disinterested. That is, they're not self-interested or concerned with the consequences of action so much as the rightness of the principle as an end in itself. Kant sought universal moral principles that are unconditional duties, which he called categorical imperatives. The rival branch of ethics, of which utilitarian ethics is a prominent example, are called consequentialist approaches, where the idea is that one judges the rightness of a rule by the goodness which it produces, by its outcomes or consequences. And so that tradition, in philosophical terms, I think the importance for it in the water sector is this is very widely adopted, either informally or explicitly, in water resources management, for example, in benefit cost analysis and other tools of modeling. Now, each of these traditions had associations with India. I won't get into them, but some of them are quite complex or kind of complicated. But what we want to do is say, okay, we have a very strong tradition of duty-based ethics from which one can draw, but what about in the Indian context? What's the parallel bodies of thought that are relevant? And here I've found the writings of a philosopher in Canada, Sham Ranganathan, quite useful for comparing Western and Indian ethical traditions. And among many other things in the work that he's done, he's kind of drawn parallels between these Western traditions of virtue ethics and consequentialism, and particularly for our purposes, deontological ethics, with different South Asian traditions of thought. And in this case, as we'll see, the predominance of ideas and resources on Dharma. He's had to do a lot of critical argument against a view that classical India didn't have very fully developed systems of ethics and ethical philosophy as compared with other branches like logic and epistemology. And I think persuasively he argues also that that's a flawed interpretation of Indian texts, and the ethical principles as well as traditions are quite highly developed and worthy of study as ethics as well as epics. So let's take a look then at the three concepts of duty. This is the kind of story up to this point, and then thinking about the context in which I've read about or in practice in the field, heard about ideas of duty that seem worthy of closer study. Three stood out for me up till now, and I hope you'll suggest some others that should be considered. But this first idea of dharma, it can't be rather overemphasized, because almost every time you will pick up a work on the concept of duty in South Asia, dharma comes to the fore. And that's, as we see, is going to be a very complicated task to try to understand exactly what that means and all of the different many meanings that it has. But in addition, we want to highlight two secular concepts of duty in the Constitution of India and in the laws of India. So the second item B here is the fundamental duties in the Constitution of India, that is the duties of citizens. And the third is, I'll call executive or administrative. These are the duties of the state. This is our outline. So let's proceed to this first question of dharma. And just take one text from the Dharma Shastras. In my initial search, and I haven't gone through the hits, that found here over 1,000 references to water in many of the ritual acts, but it goes beyond ritual. If we take just one Dharma Shastra text, the Manava Dharma Shastra, Laws of Manu, from the very first slokas there on that deal with cosmology, water figures prominently. But then there are all kinds of topics of consecration of water rituals, purification rites, prohibitions of pollution of water are called out in, and what sorts of penance is required or judicial actions are required to correct wrongs that are done. Now, this is an extraordinary body of text, but there's some questions about, well, what's the modern relevance of this when there's so many issues associated with Dharma traditions in the current context. Let's look at the different points of view that have been expressed there. And for this, I'll just suggest one volume from the Harvard series on religion and ecology, this Hinduism and ecology volume. And in that, there is an extraordinary range of views about the relationship between dharma and environment. And we can also make the connections between water with water as well. So some essays celebrate what they call dharmic ecology and the contemporary relevance of dharma traditions. Other chapters are very critical and say, look, if you look very closely, you're going to find all kinds of environmental harms and disruptions and damages that are present in these texts. And Lance Nelson used the example of the Gita. The late Anil Agarwal wrote an essay saying, can Hindu beliefs and values help India meet its ecological crisis? And I'll urge you to read the essay. I won't tell you what he said as an outcome. And then there were three chapters on rivers per se, and the crises in Yamuna, Ganga, Narmada that involve the kind of tensions and conflicts between the dharma and actual conditions in the river. It is a live tradition. There are recent water studies in the Journal of Dharma. There's a lot of contemporary discussion on the dharma and the theories of action that are relevant, it seems to me. So this kind of suggests that there's a lot to work with, but there's also an extraordinary plasticity in the concept of Dharma, and there's also a lot of concern. There are, a lot of this earlier texts are rooted in caste-based, family-based Dharma and other types of traditions against which modern India has been working in the secular context. And so before we turn to that, though, let's add one more dimension of Dharma traditions relevant in the Maharashtrian context, which is this whole topic of in particularly lively field of debate in the 19th century, what was called Maharastra Dharma, and which applied not to persons or groups, but to a whole region and to a people. That was seen as a way of thinking about regionalism, nationalism, self-rule, and related ideals. Now, this is complicated because it was historically anti-Mughal, anti-foreign, sometimes exclusionary in its politics. But again, it's surprising how many water references come up in this work, and in particular, some of the things that both Prachi Deshpande and Ann Feldhaus have written about with respect to river symbolism, pilgrimage networks, and the construction of regional identity and the mobilization, political mobilization around land and water resources. So having kind of laid out some of these aspects of Dharma traditions, let's shift from the religio-cultural category of duties to the secular ones that I'd like to put on the map, so to speak. And in particular, look at the Constitution of India and to this section of the Constitution which highlights the fundamental duties of all citizens in India. So here's how the fundamental duties figure into the Constitution. If we look at the articles and those preceding the fundamental duties, they address fundamental rights. That includes a negative duty, which is that there should be, under the right to equality, that there must be no exclusion or discrimination against the public use of wells, tanks, bathing ghats, and so on. The directive principles are those of the state. But in 1976, this additional section called Citizens' Duties was added on fundamental duties, and there are various schedules of other ways in which water topics are to be addressed at different levels of government. But this is how the fundamental duties fit. And if we see the substance of them, one of them involves a water duty. And it's this duty of every citizen to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. Now, this portion of the Constitution is non-judiciable. In other words, you can't file cases based upon this article. However, what's surprising when I did a search to Indian law, legal search on fundamental duties and water, it identified, hundreds of hits in high court and Supreme Court cases in which these fundamental duty has been cited in support of a decision. And so that's shows that even though you don't kind of have a judiciable point of law here itself, the law can draw upon it in support of a decision that's being made. Let me give one example. That's a very recent case involving Greater Noida, where there was a filling of some community tanks in a village in the Greater Noida area. And this is Jitendra Singh v. Ministry of Environment. And the court sided with the public interest litigator against the approval of the filling of these tanks and said that that was not appropriate. But what's interesting here are two items. One is that the court said that these public duties of citizens collectively can be constructed as a duty of the state. And it went on to say that, cite examples of how that had happened in the cases brought by MC Mehta in the Ganga context and elsewhere, but also indicated how this duty had been used to support the idea of mandatory environmental education for all school students in India, where the fundamental duties that are enshrined in this Article 51A are drawn into the development of the educational system of the entire country. That's a very powerful connection between this fundamental duty in the Constitution and what happens in public policy and environmental education nationwide. This part of the Constitution can't be said to be unqualified or simple ideal, because if you think about this amendment which brought this in, this was a very controversial amendment to the Constitution during the time of the emergency. So there's all kinds of ways in which it's complicated how this duty figures in with the larger process that brought it into being. Nevertheless, it's important. Now, final topic here is the question of duties of the state. And in particular, we're interested in duties of the state with respect to water. And we've done some writing recently on the very long-term historical geography of the water institutions in India, and particularly drinking water institutions, beginning with Arthashastra. And that's going to be speaking mainly of the duties of a king to develop certain water resources for the larger benefit of the kingdom, and duties to kings. So this is on the levels of kings and doesn't really usually get down to the level of villages. Similarly, Aini Akbari in the Mughal period on water administration, fairly limited on water. This expands greatly with questions of public health and sanitation in the 19th century. And then in the new constitution for India, that directive principles section is the one that starts to articulate the duties of the state. Now, at the national level of the constitution, the directive principles actually do not speak directly to questions of water, but other statutes and policies do. And I've just flagged the Maharashtrian one here. But then also the importance of the 73rd Amendment in 1992, which brought in a empowerment of Panchayati Raj institutions, that is districts, blocks, and villages, which historically have had the main responsibility or duty for developing drinking water supply and sanitation. From the 19th century onward, when it's been made explicit, it's the villages that have this responsibility to self-supply, or sometimes with some support from the state to supply water for themselves. Now, having done this review of the religio-cultural, the duties of citizens, the duties of the state, ask ourselves, well, how do these figure into the actions that occur in drinking water planning and programs in India at the local levels, these Panchayati Raj institutions, then district and block, and how do they shape what people do and why they do it, what they think is right to do and why it's right. This is so complicated. I just include here from our more field research here, who are the actors at these local levels, the persons who are in the photograph that I've put at the outset of this talk. All these different figures shaped in varying ways by the different ethical traditions and more. We've mentioned dharmic ones, which include familial types of connections as well as state responsibilities. We've mentioned the artha as well as dharma sources, the types of expectations and standards of administrative practice that are relevant at all of these levels. And so it leads to the question or the recognition, most assuredly, that this is a context of value pluralism, in which all of these different traditions and guides are relevant, but in ways that are not empirically that well understood, or when they start to interact with one another or potentially conflict with one another or pose dilemmas with one another, that too is a challenge of value pluralism. So we want to ask really on behalf of the public policy question, but also as different actors are engaged in water planning, how do they kind of articulate and then explicitly grapple with challenges of value pluralism? So value pluralism, just to make it clear, involves plural moral duties involving water. So it's it's plural ethics. And it's related to other types of pluralism, but those are somewhat different fields. So I've flagged them here, and we've mentioned some examples of political, religious, and legal pluralism, but value pluralism is somewhat distinct. And the philosophical questions are ones where one asks, is there one moral duty related to water or more? And so in the utilitarian tradition, strives to articulate one duty or measure well-being, happiness, against which all of the different and very different types of interests can be weighed and measured to come up with a realization of what action is best for society. In the deontological or values duties-based tradition, there's a recognition there can be more than one ethical value, though Kant and others argue that one should strive for a single universal value. We can ask correspondingly, is there one way to evaluate failures of moral duty where the state has, for example, failed to fulfill a duty, either didn't do it well, didn't do it right, or in a way that was good? And if there are conflicting moral duties, how are they, is there one way to address them or more than one? Now, my special interest, those are questions a philosopher might ask, but as a geographer, I'll say, well, why don't we take a look at how these duties and conflicting duties might be play themselves, be distributed on a map. And so here I'm just going to give an example from a diagrammatic approach to some of these duties of water, and see what the current situation is, just as a first indication of where I'm going with this type of analysis and what the next steps will be. In this map or diagram, we have with the new Jal Jeevan mission a declaration that there should be universal access to piped water supply and tap water in every household. Now that universal access and the duty to provide it is going to be an interesting to address from an ethics standpoint as well as from a pragmatic one. It's recognized, and in the field work that you do, that the toughest challenges are often in what are called remote and hilly habitations, places that belong to a village. They're a habitation within a Gram Panchayat, but they're disconnected, often marginal environmental terrain, sometimes marginalized people. How is that duty to be fulfilled? Once the access is provided, huge concerns with whether it proves to be and can be sustained. Piped water supplies and tap connections are vulnerable to all kinds of challenges of sustainability. And for whom does that duty, on whom does it fall, and how is it to be sustained? If all of this is successful in bringing new water and sustaining it over time, those increased water supplies result in some additional problems of environmental drainage. And so these drainage problems, to whom does that duty fall, and on what grounds is it to be fulfilled? Because we see in so many built environments poor drainage conditions, and so one can anticipate this is going to happen. And the Jal Jeevan Mission even has a acknowledgement that this is likely to happen, but how will it be addressed and by whom? Ultimately, if all of these things are successfully wind up with the return flows in wastewaters that end up in nalas, and we know the conditions there, and the question of how nalas can be addressed in as ethical questions as well as practical ones comes to mind. So this is just a map and a suggestion that it's going to be different people with different justifications and perhaps slightly different definitions of duty that are relevant in each of these spatial and geographical contexts. And so as we start to articulate what those are and for where and for whom, it's interesting to indicate some of the ways in which these different challenges fall to different social groups and with different types of rationales, so that we see a pattern in how the state, nation state, and the states such as Maharashtra have been increasingly involved in financing and supporting the construction of new water supplies. But then the sustainability of them falls to the local community. And the ethics of that community and the duties that it assumes and discharges are going to have a different rationale from those of the state in the initial construction. And we can imagine how these are going to be in alignment or well coordinated with one another, or not well coordinated with one another, where one solution starts to generate other problems, or that you have a more unified approach to duties that will lead to the type of good outcome that one would aspire to. This is, as far as the analysis has gotten up till now, the type of approach to the duties of water and value pluralism then in the work that I've done. And I would really be enormously interested in the types of questions and suggestions you might have for me. Thanks for all of my colleagues and supporters in MIT and government of Maharashtra, and colleague JVR Murthy, and all of our wonderful graduate research assistants that have contributed to the work that we've done over the past 5 years. That's what I'd hope to share with you today, Pushkar and Sarah, and we really would welcome any of the questions and thoughts that you might have to help push this type of work further. Thanks again.
Sure. Thank you very much for that. It was very interesting, and I urge everybody to post questions, as a couple of people have done already, into the chat box or raise your hand. In the meantime, I shall get started with a question. I have a few questions from the audience, but perhaps it might be easier to club or pool some of them together. But in South Asia, historically, the provision of water for farming and gardens was an important act of kingship, and the ideals of kingship in both Indic and Persianate traditions placed a very similar value on the provision of water for civic welfare. And so water governance in many ways has been a central feature of governance and kingship. And do modern political and legal systems undermine the ethical and moral basis of water governance, reducing it to merely technocratic and legal?
It's a great question, and the on the duties of kingship, a good king, you have many such texts that establish this. Now, the actual performance of that duty is not as well documented in, say, archaeological and epigraphic evidence. So you would expect to see that the kings actually did this, when in fact, it seems that to a large extent, the villages were on their own to dig their wells and to construct their tanks. And there was a lot of local philanthropy, and the philanthropic sector played an important role in different regions of India. However, I think the really important principle is that there was in those early classical texts, but also at the current time, a sense that the state has this duty to its citizens, and that endures, and it frustrates a lot of, I'll call it the more liberalization kind of philosophy, which doesn't necessarily accept the principle that the state has a duty to provide water, but rather that citizens and communities have a duty to secure their own water with support from the state, but the primary duty falls on local groups. So there's a great tension between some of the liberal and liberalization movement and the statist tradition and its earlier kinship that isn't fully appreciated as to the depth of the expectation of that the state will do this. A good state would do this for its people, and that is what helps to define what a good state is. That the good there is not fully appreciated by the more liberalization tradition in water resources management.
Now, Amit Mitra has a question, which is, it's really a comment that says, inclusion of Islamic and Christian traditions of water duties in India would be very useful, because these traditions, as we know, are also centuries old in the subcontinent, and in a syncretic way help to form contemporary notions of water duties.
This is really important, and that's why I began with the first study on the right of thirst and human right to water in Islamic water law, and the map that shows that really this is a large minority in India, particularly, but also we've found that Christian Sikh traditions in Punjab have these types of principles as well. Very different rationale, so that if you take it in a formal ethical sense and try to generalize, the Islamic tradition is what ethicists would call it a divine command theory. So in the revelation, that it's a command from God that these duties will be assumed, and that such rights exist. This is for humans and animals, and this is either in Quranic or Hadith tradition. So that how do you kind of have a divine command tradition of ethics in dialogue with other approaches that are that don't have that same rationale or logic? This is the challenge of value pluralism. It's one that for which there's enormous scope, but it's not as fully embraced up till now as it could be or should be. And in the Indian context, that's particularly relevant when you look at major survey works on Indian ethics. They rarely include the ethics of Islam or Christianity or post-classical types of sources. But that's certainly, it would be very exciting to pursue that.
Kanchan Chopra has a question. How can the citizen take on the duty of environmental drainage? Would it not be community or state local institutions instead?
Yeah, great question. So if you think about it spatially, the challenge of environmental drainage begins in the home. So we've sometimes called this approach to environmental drainage gur, gully, and gao. So at the gur level, the sullage water is either being discharged into a drainage or just discharged out just outside the edge of the home into the gully or the lane. Now at the lane level, each household can do its thing by either capturing that water for small kitchen gardens, for soak pits, other types of immediate on-site treatment, or then collaborating lane by lane, start to have some more community-based or neighborhood-based approaches to environmental drainage. And then as one scales beyond that, when the water is flowing from lanes into a choke, it becomes a GAL or a village-based challenge to be addressed at a larger scale. But one hopes to tackle it as far back along that chain as one can. But you're quite right that most commonly it ends up being a larger problem because it is not addressed as fully as it can be in the immediate sources of the drainage.
Raman Ahuja has a question. Are there ways to integrate the idea of water as a living being with that of water management by different actors? So moving the discourse from a static to a dynamic one.
Yes, well, and also the status of a living being question is an interesting one. In New Zealand, that's been taken up explicitly. So in New Zealand, you have examples of that, and you have even a higher level of ontology if you consider the goddess status of rivers. Again, Anne Feldhaus, in her book on water and womanhood in Maharastra, has drawn attention to, it's not just Ganga or Yamuna that are goddesses, all of them, Godavari, Krishna, Bhima, are all have the status of goddess. And that brings in gender questions related to water, but to what extent the kinds of engagement with rivers as living or as having an ontological status of their own with human beings. This calls for maybe that, this is where I put a blank portion of the ethics where we're kind of missing a major tradition of ethics that should be added. They call it EcoFeminist ethics, call it PostHumanist ethics. There's a number of possibilities that are coming onto the map that should be considered, but that would be a very, very creative and radical type of approach.
There's a question from David Grunfeld, which is, in the context of indigenous ethics about water, the importance of relational values is starkly different from modernistic contexts. So for example, the river as your grandmother or as a deity. So could you comment on the relational values as part of the good that is dependent on ethical protection?
That's a great question. And so if I were starting to think about how to approach it, we could kind of approach it at the on the contemporary side of theories of relational values. At the same time, we could also look at some of the more classical sources of a family dharma, in which those familial relations are addressed in great detail, and the complexities when they start to conflict with other types of values also can start to be, you can start to see how those are addressed in different sources and traditions in India. But one can start at either end with the kind of re-theorization based on contemporary relational philosophy, or you can just kind of go from a traditional and try to see, well, to what extent these can square with one another or complement one another in the kind of both a theoretical level, but also more substantive context. I don't think I quite nailed that one, but I think it's a great question.
And there is a comment from Seema Kulkarni, which resonates with comments that have been made by people earlier, like Amit Mitra, which is the fund system in Maharashtra is a traditional community-based system of water sharing. But such communities usually exclude women and other exploited groups of people. And how much community is community, I guess.
Yeah, so this question of inclusion and exclusionary traditions and politics is enormously important, and we see, great debates about this in historical sources. So that whereas some traditions are exclusionary of, say, I'm going to say, this is in the Maharashtrian context of Maratha and non-Maratha communities, very inclusionary with respect to anyone who can have a status in a Maratha context, but it may be exclusionary of others. But then there are many who've challenged this over the years. So you think of Vinoba Bhava saying, no, Hindus, Muslims, everyone is included in this community at large. And the all of the work on water and gender, work that Sarah and colleagues have advanced on the inclusion of women. It has a historical or cultural basis for making that argument, as well as a justice basis in the contemporary world, and far from fully realized. So this question of inclusionary politics has got to be at the heart of any ethical water ethics, it seems to me. We have too many examples of the exclusionary cases, but they provide examples that can be very explicitly challenged.
We have a question from Amitanshu Acharya. How does one ethically separate the social and the natural in religious practice? For example, ideas of purity of nature in the Manusmriti correspond with ideas of purity in society. So you have caste hierarchy and so on. So how do we entangle this complexity?
Okay, in a very simple, perhaps simplistic way, I'd suggest that we have several major traditions of ethics that are either monist or dualist. So that for those dualist traditions of, say, philosophy that distinguish the domain of nature and spirit, say Sankhya Yoga traditions would be one, which is a dualist. That you've got the origin of the problem right there. In other more monist types of approaches, there's a ways in which these relationships between the purity of persons and of natural conditions are seen as continuous and interrelated, and so there's less of a, that's more conducive to the direction I think the question is heading. But in the dualist context, how can it be addressed? Well, either by the use of analogy, to say that, in this case, purity is defined in these terms, and by analogy, we find it to be true in other species or environmental systems as well. And so in the Islamic context, just as an example, there's the reference to the communities of animals forming, they form communities like you, like humans. So that type of analogy is a very crucial mode of reasoning to establish those connections and to strengthen them, it seems to me.
Gopal Krishna asks, is it the case that Asian religions grapple with natural heritage, including water, unlike non-Asian ones? Is it not the case that Platonian or Kantian or utilitarian or Westphalian mathematical determinism undermine the rights of water bodies?
This is a good question, but what I've tried to do at a slide about halfway through is to show that there are these kind of distinction between East and West. And all of it, you'll notice all these case studies I've done is about all the kinds of ways in which the flow of ideas and the interactions between even the North American and South Asian context have indicated close relationships, so that the distinction East and West is probably more problematic than useful. And that even within each of these traditions, sometimes when you really pursue them in kind of in greater depth, you find that they have a greater openness to the types of values you may want to find or advance. So that one of the strongest proponents for animal rights, Peter Singer, is a ardent utilitarian, and so you've got, I think, an initial perhaps point of contrast as a starting point, but always in both historical terms, but also theoretical terms, looking for the connections and the analogs between traditions seems to me to be a very, very promising way forward.
And now for the last question, unless somebody has a burning question which absolutely needs answering today. The question is from Seema Kulkarni again, which asks, how does this understanding expand the scope of water governance? What is the message for duties of the state in the present context?
Right. Okay. This is a great concluding question, and I'd almost want to try to answer it on the multiple levels, because if you think of state and state governance, water governance, it's surprising how each of the levels of governance in the state, even in formal terms, are so distinct from one another. They're interrelated constitutionally and otherwise, but they're actual life worlds of the actors at the Gram Panchayat level, and even sub-Gram Panchayat in different habitations or wadis. Governance questions in that context have historically been of one sort, and the next levels up of blocks and districts, even though they're all grouped together as Panchayati Raj institutions, even back to Mughal times, I can find, examples of how Parganas and other types of state governance were part and parcel of a larger imperial state, national state. And so they have tended to operate differently, blocks and districts. Now, in the case of Maharashtra, the emphasis has been on districts historically. In other states, it's on blocks. So in the Maharashtrian context, we've argued, just in a very recent publication, came out last month, about the importance of blocks, and that blocks are somehow under realized in terms of their potential in water governance, and in part because they have with about 100 villages each, they have some greater homogeneity of conditions that they can help address at the watershed, aquifer level, and so on. But historically, that's been less developed. Now, as we go up to the higher levels, the question that comes to mind is consider the ways in which the nation state, notwithstanding all the policies that argue for devolution down to local empowerment, self-rule on the water sector, the nation state retaining a very high level of involvement, say in the Jal Jeevan mission, and specifying all of the kind of ways in which it's to be implemented, as well as the bold aspirations for providing water for all. So I think that there needs to be at each level, and then across levels, some systematic reflection on the duties that they each have, and the reasons why the duties have, but also could take a kind of more progressive direction at each of these levels. That type of systematic move from what up to now, much of our work has been descriptive ethics of, at each level, here's what each group does. In normative terms, what ought to be these water governance relations at each level, between levels, and of society in relationship to the state at each of them as well. That type of a systematic project would be a great collaborative research project for us, I would think, at your center. Anyway, that's the thought. I would also be grateful if these kind of 25 questions in the chat could be somehow copied. I know when we stop a Zoom, they disappear. So if anyone's able to kind of copy them down, I would be enormously grateful for that.
I will send you a transcript of the questions.
Great, thank you.
There's one more comment from Gopal Krishna. Imagination of water duties as divorced from land duties seems to be inspired by a feudal and colonial legacy. So
Oh, goodness, this is a great question as to the relationship between land and water, and so many other kind of subdivisions and categories. So when I speak of drinking water, the initial challenge ought to be, well, how is that connected with irrigation and other types of water subsectors that have developed over the years? But the linkage between land and water is also kind of a fascinating history, and the separation. There's some very strong linkages. So that with a groundwater right, you have to have a land right, oftentimes, to pump from an aquifer. So the land right gives title to tapping the groundwater resource in many contexts. By contrast, a lot of property rights to water, irrigation rights, are disconnected with the land. Is this a colonial heritage? I think that's a really great historical question. It could be. It could be that the development of the large surface water irrigation systems disconnected water from the land in a very large scale types of ways in the large scale 19th century irrigation systems, and from which we have yet to kind of find some ways of reconnecting these resources, and even beyond that, land and water is separated from the habitats and ecological and organisms that depend upon them. It seems an even greater disconnect through which water came to be regarded as a physical resource rather than an ecological phenomenon.
all right. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Sarah to propose a vote of thanks.
Thanks a lot, Pushkar, and thank you, Jim, for this very exhaustive and extensive waterscapes in a way of ideas around duties, values, and ethics. And I mean, the Indian landscape is so very complex. It's faith, it's caste, it's gender, so many things, as well as, of course, the fundamental laws in the constitution, etc. 2 points that I just want to bring up from my work in closing, because you mentioned hydro philanthropy, and a lot of that was done by women in terms of the step wells in Gujarat and Rajasthan, which we've also been exploring in the Living Waters Museum in our work. And I think, and also the work of people like Yuta Jain, what we find over there is that there are, I mean, whilst these were meritorious acts to provide water for local communities, etc., very often the people who built these step wells, the artisans who were usually either Muslims or from the low caste communities, were excluded from access. So you kind of then, wonder what kind of, value ethic is that? And then the other one is from my own PhD work in 1986 on the cleaning of the Ganga in Varanasi. And I took that up as a topic because when Rajiv Gandhi launched the first Ganga Action Plan, he said that this is the program for the people of India, that we want everyone to participate. It is not a program for government officers, by alone. And I thought to myself, how are people going to participate to clean a river, which they fundamentally believe is pure and sacred? And, so that set off a whole chain of work and thinking in Varanasi for me, like a sort of deep dive into public health and history and administrative history and all. I found the work of James Scott very useful in terms of inversing power structures, inversing hierarchies, and what he talked about the weapons of in the weapons of the weak, and what was unfolding in that context as well sometimes, and how people contest these ideas. Of course, there was a lot of backlash on the Ganga Action Plan in the 80s because we had more of a soft state in power then than we do now. And and how there were notions of dirt as matter out of place. What was on the surface may be dirty, but the water underneath was clean and pure and so forth. And of course, many other belief systems. But a lot of issues that also arose on the ghats of Benares amongst Hindus and Muslims, and who had access to which ghats, and what did what. So there is this complexity and these layers. It's like peeling an onion. It's so complex in India, understanding and unpacking values and ethics and so forth. So I want to thank you very much, Jim, for laying some of this context out for us. For the audience, there's a lot of work that Jim has done and shared with us, and if you're interested, we can definitely pass on some links and some articles and some PDFs to you if that's something that some of you are interested in. Jim, if you have anything else that you'd like to share with the audience over here, I'm sure we can try and do that. And look forward to your participation in the lecture next month, which has Amy Sharrox, an artist based in the UK who started something called the Museum of Water there. And Amy will be in conversation with me where we look at how water museums around the world look at this question of ethics and water, and what kind of, how we're sort of shaping the stories around water and trying to encourage a new way of looking and thinking about water. Yeah. So thank you, everyone. I hope there are no more last comments and questions or anything else, but if you do have, you can raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll be closing this now. Jim, any last words from you? Or?
Well, just great appreciation. Some of the best questions I've had in the talk. So I really am excited. I've written them down myself, but I'll be grateful to the transcript so I can reflect on them further. For many of the studies that I have, most of them are available full text on academia.edu or researchgate.net. So that would be a great source of PDFs for people or questions that you might have. And of course, the Ganga is a topic we should have for a special discussion, as there's yet another chapter unfolding in that right now.
Yeah, of course. We will also have a recording of this talk, which everyone will have access to. I think Shalini has shared a link, but Shalini, there's a link, right, YouTube?
Yes, I already gave the links on the chat and also gave the Twitter thread, just in case if there are any changes to the link, people can go to the Twitter thread and check. But we have been tweeting live during the session, so there has been quite a bit of interest in this. Thank you, James. This was really, really exciting, and also great participation from everyone today. Yeah. And and we look forward to the next talk in this season. Thank you so much. So we'll stop the live stream now, and we are also